Okay, so we will get started now. Welcome. Very exciting to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. Welcome to the third online Inform seminar, which has been a new departure in COVID. But it's been fantastic to see so many colleagues from all over the world. Really exciting. So today we're here to celebrate the publication and launch of Eileen Barker and Jim Richardson's new book, Reactions to the Law by Minority Religions, in the Inform book series, which Eileen's going to talk about in a second. I think most of you here are familiar with Inform, but if anyone's coming to this for the first time, Inform was established by Professor Eileen Barker back in 1988 at the London School of Economics, with direct funding from the UK government to provide accurate and up-to-date information about groups that were considered often called at that time cults, but now more widely new religious movements, cults, sects, minority religions. And we take a really broad and inclusive view, trying to bring the insights of the social sciences to the general public and make quality, up-to-date information accessible so people can make informed choices about a variety of issues to do with minority religions. So I'm not going to say too much about the book because we're going to have Eileen introduce the book series, and then we'll have 3 respondents to the book who I'll introduce in turn. And then we're going to have a response to a particular chapter in the book, and then the co-author Jim Richardson should be able to respond to all the respondents. After this, we're going to open up the book chapter authors a chance if they want to make a 2 to 3 minutes comment on either their own chapter or what people had said in response to their chapter or the proceedings so far. And then we'll open it up to general question and answers. So I'm going to be quite strict with asking people to stop talking if they go on too much, just because there's quite a lot of people who want to speak, and we also want to have some time for general questions. The other important bit of housekeeping is that we're recording this and we'll put it on YouTube afterwards. We'll put an edited version up, and if you have any concerns about aspects of the recording, you can email Inform. If you want to remain anonymous, basically don't have your video on and don't have your audio on, and if everyone can keep themselves muted unless they want to speak. If you want to ask a question during the question and answer period, there's a few different ways you can do this. You can raise your hand and I'll try to keep an eye on the participants list and call on you to say something. You can also write a message in the chat box. You can write a message with your name on it that everyone can see, and I can read that out, or I can ask if you'd like to clarify. And also, if you want to ask an anonymous question, where it says "to" at the bottom of the chat box, if you do it to Suzanne Newcomb, then it'll be a private message to me and I'll ask it on your behalf, and no one will know who asked the question. So I think that's pretty much all the housekeeping aspects. Do just get in touch with us at inform@kcl.ac.uk if you have any comments or questions afterwards, and suggestions for what we could do better or what we did amazingly well. We like to hear them both, and anything you want to say. So I will hand over to Eileen to introduce the book series, the Inform Routledge book series that she's been the editing and spearheaded for the last several years.
Thanks, Suzanne. You've said some of what I was going to say, so that makes things easier. Can you now see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Well, Inform is now at King's. Suzanne's told you that it was founded in order to produce reliable information about minority religions. And to do that, we have to collect information, which is done by the staff, one way or another. And we also have an international network. That's what the N in Inform stands for, network. and a whole lot of potential sources. And right from the beginning, we've made a point of including the religions that we're studying themselves, if they will speak to us or write to us or have any relationship with us, and their opponents. So we accept information from everywhere. This all has to be sorted, and we've got thousands of books and filing cabinets and a very big electronic database, which has over 5,000 different religious organizations and a whole lot of other things on it. And then, because of all these different ideas, we have to assess and contextualize them. And the methods of the social sciences are what we try and rely on as much as possible. All the staff have got degrees. The main research staff have got PhDs in sociology of religion. And then disseminating the information. It's no good if people don't get to hear about it. And originally this was just with people phoning up or coming to see us, but then the media would start using some of our stuff, so it would be disseminated that way. And then we've developed quite a large website, which you can go to and get quite a bit of information there. Then we started having, well, right from the start actually, we were having large international conferences, which were open to everyone, and workshops which were closed, but for particular groups, like the police or social services or clergy, and then seminars. And these were day-long and open to everyone. And we've had about 50 of those, or over 50 probably. And in 2013, we started to think it would be an idea to have a book series coming out of the seminars. We've got other literature publications, leaflets, and various books as well. And the first book we produced was for Her Majesty's Stationery Office, the Home Office published it. And this was a practical introduction to new religions, written mainly for parents, but actually has been used by a whole lot of other people as well. And then one of the first conferences, Bob Towler, who was our director for a short time, edited some books. And Jean Lafontaine, who's one of our research fellows, took a workshop and a seminar, some papers from those and some other ones, to produce a book about Satanism. And this is when we decided that we would try and do a book series, which we did with Ashgate to begin with. And the policy behind the seminars and the book series is that we're open to everybody. And we hope that the seminars and book series will be accessible to everyone. And we have speakers who cover a wide range of different types of people. Each seminar and book focuses on a particular topic or issue from a very wide variety of perspectives, which includes all these people, including the religions themselves, current and former members and relatives, etc. And as I said, there've been about 50 of those, and there are to date 15 of the Ashgate, and then it's become Routledge series when Routledge took over from Ashgate. And I just run through some of these quickly. Tim Miller did the first one on intentional communities. Then we had state responses to the new religions, and then prophecy, which was edited by Suzanne and Sarah. This was done for the 2012, and the expectations of something happening then was rife. Amanda, who some of you will know and worked for Inform for, I don't know, 15 years or something, did one on fraud. Then we had an historical perspective one, and then the changes that took place in the new religious movements. One on the new religions which come out of popular culture. There's sort of imagined religions, Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster and the Jedi Knights and people like that. Then one about uncertainty, which was the response that the religions have to uncertainty. There's a chapter on conspiracy theories, for example. One on African new religious movements, a more qualitative one that George Chryssidis, who's chair of our management committee, edited. Global religions, how they move and how they change as they migrate across the world. And then imagining what the future might be like for the new religions. There's some interesting chapters from people who were themselves in the religions and trying to imagine what they looked like. One on counseling. This is interesting because we had at least one previous deprogrammer and several people connected with what used to be called the anti-cult movement, and who now do exit counseling, contributed to that. Legal cases, Jim and François Bélanger edited this, seeing how the law reacted to the new religions. And then we come to the present one, which is how the new religions react to the law. And then in the pipeline, we've got some radical transformations and health and healing and minority religions coming up. Just to add a bit, the focus, as I've said, is on a particular topic from a wide variety of perspectives. And there isn't any attempt to reach any particular conclusion. But what we're trying to do is demonstrate different understandings that are possible of the particular topic or issue. And obviously there are still thousands of different possible viewpoints, and we can't present them all. So they've never claimed to be balanced in the way that some academic books try to be. The chapters might be balanced or they might not. What we're going to do is offer information to readers that they might not already have, and just to have a peek at some of the perspectives that they might not share. Now, a problem arises, obviously, if a particular group believes that it's been misrepresented, and this has happened on occasion, and on a couple of times we've invited the group to write a response, which we've included in the book. Given them a couple of pages or so, 700 words, in which they've said why they disagree with certain aspects of the chapter that's about them. And what's happened in this book is that I invited a member, Mike Mickler, of one of the different sections of the Unification Church, one of the different splinters, to write an article. And he included in this a discussion of an ongoing court case. And we probably should have invited the other unification section to respond, but we didn't. And so we're going to give a representative of this other unification movement the chance to respond briefly here, and we'll put a lot larger response on the website. So that's just one of the problems of producing, or challenges perhaps I should say, as well as the excitement of having a whole lot of different attitudes and perspectives. So this, I'm not going to go through it, is the table of the contents of the present book, which I think most of you will have seen anyway, because it was sent out with the invitation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Eileen. You're exactly at 10 minutes. So a good example for our next speakers. And our first respondent to the book is Dr. Marat, who has been associated with Inform for a very long time and has graciously found us a home within the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College London, where he's head of departments. And he was He studied with Eileen, and he's been a great help and support in various capacities to Inform over many years.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for this nice words. Yes, I'm sorry, I belong to this kind of tribe of collectively exhausted academics. So under the pandemic, so I'm going to read my response, so if you don't mind. And let me start by following up from what Eileen said about the Inform Routledge series. And kind of, although Eileen said you can't generalize about the series, I'll try to make a couple of generalizations. And I think the series is indeed a truly unique genre in many ways. And let me add some additional thoughts on the merits of this series, which I'd like to use as a basis for evaluation of this particular volume. First, this series, as indeed Inform seminars on which it is based, is a unique source of knowledge, not only about religious minorities themselves, but also about the other stakeholders involved in public debates on them. Yes, they're framed by the academic editors, but what is important that it gives a voice to all concerned parties. If you like, it gives them an agency to publicly represent themselves. And one obvious outcome of this dialogical representation is that it enhances the social capital of those involved. One less obvious outcome of this dialogical representation is that it enhances the social capital of those involved in it. And in other words, their ability to become known, to gain more trust, and ultimately to gain resources to enhance their stance in society. We need to appreciate that this approach reflects at least 5 decades of painstaking and often challenging research, which required direct involvement of academics with little known groups, movements, and religious practitioners that were often seen as unpopular and even threatening. And this volume brings this tradition of research into engagement with new religions, if you like, into sharp relief. Its title already evokes the, if you like, underlying drama of both religious minorities' situation in society and academic research on them. One actor in this drama is religious minorities themselves, who, to paraphrase Jason Bidan's expression quoted at the beginning of Tony Brace's excellent contribution to these volumes, is building a system of belief and practice from the raw material of revealed religious truth without predetermining what is it to be found there. But on the other hand, to use another famous quotation, let justice be done though the heavens should fall. Law is designed to protect the very norms and behaviors that may or may not be compatible with religious truths and religious truths, beliefs, and practice. The great merit of this volume is that it shows a variety of ways in which this underlying drama can unfold, be experienced, and explained. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first volume that systematically focuses on the reactions of minority religions to law, as opposed to the much more explored theme of legal reactions to minority religions. Religious practitioners contributing to this volume are those who have been in the forefront of defending the acceptability of their practices under law. Tony Brace on behalf of Jehovah's Witnesses, Eric Roy writing for the Church of Scientology, Peter Zora sharing his experience in defending the rights of the members and the leaders of the Unification Church. What is particularly valuable in these contributions is that they offer accounts of their first-hand experiences in different countries with their different political and legal contexts, illuminating us of how different the outcomes of these negotiations with the different Caesars, if you like, can be. Taken together, they reveal a much underappreciated fact of how the reactions of these minority groups contribute to the public discreditation of prejudice and expansion of religious freedom. This dovetails well with what the contributions of academics, examining how different legal contexts can result in different legal behaviors and ultimately produce variations and changes within the same movements. I'm referring to Susan Palmer and Shane Dissolt's chapter on the dukhobors in Tsarist Russia and Canada. Masato Kata's exploration of the changes in the Japanese movement Tenrikyo in response to the legal environment in France, and Marie-Yves Malançon and Jennifer Gaiba's analysis of the essence in France and Canada. To some extent, the theme continues in Effie focuses discussion of the differences in ways minority religions in different countries engage with the European Court of Human Rights. Though her theme is much broader and involves a number of other aspects of the minority religions' reactions to the European Court of Human Rights. Academic accounts taken together provide an important counterpoint to what the representations of minority religions don't say. In particular, namely the ways in which their encounters with law, I mean the minority religions' encounters with law, trigger changes in them. And in this sense, Eileen Ishiyama's contribution is very important, and its contribution a very significant aspect of this whole, if you like, conversation, the reaction to law of a minority religion, in this case, Aum Shinrikyo, that deals with the consequences of their atrocious acts of violence. While these contributions examine different engagements of specific movements in legal, with legal environments, Ringui's analysis focuses on a particular country, his native Estonia, and in my view, it can serve almost as a palimpsest for exploring the relationship between law and religious minorities, given that it's a small country where big events are taking place in relation to minority religions. Finally, Massimo Intraviglia and Rosita Shurice take us to a hugely unexplored territory of how a religious minority, in this case, the Church of the Almighty God, deals with the political asylum laws and regulations in its attempt to help its practitioners fleeing persecution in China. It's a very important, if you like, territory, research territory to explore. Finally, theoretical thoughts adds both academic and practical value to this volume. Again, something that is distinctive to the entire Inform Routledge series. In particular, in this volume, Arjen Barker's typology of religious minority reactions to law in the introductory chapter, and Jim Richardson's typology of legal environments in which these reactions occur have a great academic value in both provoking and framing future research. Added to that can be the elegant typology of legal strategies of minority religions offered by Marie-Yves Malançon and Jennifer Gaiba. However, these typologies are also utterly usable, I would say, for various practitioners involved in legislation, litigation, and humanitarian work involving religious minorities, such as legal practitioners and human rights NGOs. Despite this wealth of information, ideas, concepts, and explanations, I'd still wish to see a couple of things clarified or added, and let me point to them in the form of questions, and I leave you with that. Would it be useful, for example, to clarify what kind of religious minorities the volume is focusing on, sort of clarify the concept of religious minorities used in this volume? To what extent would the observations and conceptual frames used in the volume apply to more established religious minorities? For example, more established Islamic minorities in Western countries, or more established Jewish groups outside Israel, or even Eastern Orthodox groups, for example, in Catholic majority countries and so on, or Protestant majority countries. Would it be useful, second question, would it be useful to include accounts of legal practitioners of their experiences with the religious minorities? One interesting example would be obviously Lord Justice Ward's account of his experience in the custody case involving a member of the Children of God, which is mentioned in Eileen's introduction. But what is interesting, that Tony Bradney, a prominent scholar of religion and law, actually criticized Lord Justice for imposing requirements on a religious group to denounce its leader and some of its practices. Bradney sees it as unacceptable. And Lord Justice Ward, in his book based on the court case, responds to this in a very, I would say, personal way, referring to his, if you like, to the effects of the reactions of this minority religion to the legal proceedings themselves. I'm leaving you with that. Thank you very much for this volume, and thank you for the chance to speak about it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Marat. We're going to have general question and answers at the end, just to remind you, and you were also very spot on 10 minutes. So our next response is coming from Mark Hill, QC, who has an impressive array of academic affiliations, as well as being a practicing barrister and specialist in ecclesiastical law. And he's a new colleague of mine at the Open University to add to his academic affiliations. So Mark.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. It's a joy to be here this evening. It's a joy to be launching this absolutely magnificent book. So first of all, congratulations to Eileen and to Jim for getting together such a magnificent group of contributors and producing such a varied work. Now, Jim, I hope you'll forgive me if I spend a few moments reminiscing about my first meeting with Eileen Barker. And I remember it very well because it was in December of 2006. And the two of us who'd never met each other, were both commissioned to speak at a conference at the University of Grodno in Belarus. And we found ourselves on the same flight. We met as we were clearing immigration at Minsk, and we were placed into a rather dilapidated minibus, which I suspect had failed more than one MOT. And we set off as dusk was falling. It had become completely dark by the time we'd left the city limits of Minsk, and yet our journey wasn't over. We had another 4 or 5 hours to drive in the dark in order to get to Grodno, which is almost on the border with Poland. And at the beginning of the journey, I knew nothing about Eileen, and I knew nothing about Inform. But I rather suspect by the end of the journey, I knew everything about Eileen and pretty much everything about Inform. So it's a joy after all that time to be speaking about the latest output from Inform in the shape of this magnificent book on reactions to the law by minority religions. Now, the conference in Grodno was organized by the State Committee on Religions and Nationalities. And what impressed me by all those who were speaking was that it had very much a multidisciplinary approach, a very much a cross-disciplinary approach, whereby people within religious communities, social science experts, and others were able to communicate and share their experience based on their particular background. And I'm thrilled that that general approach, which dominated the way in which the conference was led, is also to be reflected in the book in the terms of the choice of contributors and the choice of subject matter of each of those chapters. And I think many of you, like me, will be more than familiar, arguably rather bored, with academic literature on the state's posture towards religious minorities. We've read that, we've chewed it over until there's very little meat left on that particular bone. But the novelty and the value of this contribution is that it takes a completely different approach. It looks at matters from the other end of the telescope, and it examines the posture of religious minorities towards the law. And I mean both conceptually to the idea of law and lawmaking, but also to the detailed domestic law of the countries in which those religious minorities find themselves to be acting. And speaking as a practicing lawyer, a lawyer who has represented both governments and religious minorities over the years, I've found this particularly interesting. And I don't think there's a single page of this volume on which there isn't something new that I'm coming to afresh. So as a repository of fresh, new, vital and relevant information, this volume is second to none. But I was slightly troubled in the opening chapter by Eileen that she deals with not just the approach of religious minorities towards law, but the approach of religious minorities towards lawyers. And if, like me, you've read those passages, it's a pretty frightening position. She gives two particular examples, which I must say sent a shiver down my spine. The first was in relation to members of the Synanon movement who found themselves putting a 4-foot rattlesnake in the letterbox of a lawyer who was investigating that movement. And I tell you now, I check my letterbox each night before I go to bed, just in case. And the other more troubling example was in relation to a lawyer working on a class action of the Shterin doomsday cult, who was indeed murdered by those he was investigating. So in some ways, although Zoom is a pretty impersonal way of dealing with things, I'm rather pleased tonight to be speaking to you via Zoom, and at least I'm safe from some of those more horrific stories that featured in Eileen's particular chapter. But what's helpful, I think, leaving aside the lawyers and looking at the law, is to examine the different vantage points which minority religions have towards the governing law of the state where they operate. And there's a passive, observant approach where one sees nothing but compliance with the law, and against that, the far more drastic violation of the law in circumstances such as those that I have indicated. What comes out not merely from Eileen's chapter from elsewhere, and this is yet another myth which is being exploded, is that those examples, whilst they attract newspaper headlines the world over, are comparatively rare in real life. Equally rare, but equally interesting, are those examples where it could be argued that minority religions have adopted, or rather adapted, their doctrine in order to comply with the domestic law of the land. And I think this particular aspect is something which could helpfully be investigated further in future volumes under this general umbrella. We're told, for example, of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints changing their teaching on polygamy. But I suspect, although I'm not sure, that was a much more nuanced change. It wasn't simply a change to comply with the marriage law of the US states where they were operating. I think there was perhaps a little more that was going on inside. We also see examples of religious movements hiding from the law, challenging the law, but equally mobilizing the law. And this is where I come perhaps to Jim Richardson's particularly impressive examination of where he sees perhaps a recent trend among minority religions to make sure that their members are fully appraised of what the law is, that they study it in a high level of detail in order that they can use the law of the country to obtain the best advantage for where one needs to be. And this, I think, is reflective of a continuum which, if one traces back over the last couple of centuries, is clear and perceptible, whereby one starts with the idea of religious toleration, that awfully mean, grudging word, whereby states tolerate, put up with this nasty smell under the nose, but it's just allowed to be there. And that's the way in which often minority religions are permitted to operate. But moving to a completely different area where instead of being tolerated, those minority religions are actively asserting their own rights, using properly the law of the land to their own ends. And I think we see that very clearly in Ringo Ringvi's chapter dealing with Estonia, clearly under that wonderful heading of stand up for your rights. Minority religions taking the law and deploying it as they see fit for their advantage, both as individual believers and as an association of co-believers. And a term I found Jim Richardson using, which was new to me and I shall deploy in the future, is the concept of cause lawyering. The idea that there are lawyers committed to a particular social cause who will take up litigation in order to pursue items of social change. And that's quite a new dynamic, the idea of law and lawyers being used to achieve an advantage for minority religions generally, and for freedom of religion in its broader conceptual sense. But again, I want to flag a tiny word of concern where that is concerned. And it's really to examine what's actually going on with this dynamic. Is it the mobilization of the religious organizations through the use of law? Or is it perhaps something more than that? And lawyers are pursuing their own rights. We will have to wait and see how that pans out. There's clear from the other chapters the idea of the associational freedom of religion, the idea to obtain legal entity status, which is either designed by the state to cooperate and to allow religious organizations to flourish, or conversely, it's designed to create data by which to control those religious organizations. And my final observation is linked to the first, and that's the concept of perhaps it's time we drew up a minority religions litigious league table to see which minority religion is the most litigious. and it may be Michael Mickler could put in a claim for the Unification Church, Eric Rue for the Church of Scientology, and Effie Focus can offer information about a range of religions within the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. You've indulged me quite long enough. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to say what a magnificent book it is, and to say how thrilled I am that the two editors have brought it to completion. I'm delighted to be part of this evening's launch.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your very interesting observations. We'll move on to our third respondent, who is Professor Milda Ališauskienė, who's in the Department of Political Sciences at Vytautas, I'll probably mispronounce that as well, Magnus University in Lithuania. And she's got a long-term publication record in this field and brings a slightly different perspective from her area of discipline and expertise to this subject. So Milda.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for our invitation to contribute to this meeting. I would like also to congratulate all the editors and all the authors of the book. And of course, it's always a challenge to speak in a row. And now I'm the third here responding to this book. So sorry for some repetition, probably. That will inevitably be there. I will also try to follow what I have written on this really very interesting and enlightening volume. So as we have already heard, one of co-editors, Eileen Barker, put it that previous volumes published within this Inform book series have addressed various issues related to law and minority religions, and they were mainly focusing on the place of minority religions in various political and legal contexts. While the newest volume has special focus on the way minority religions reacted to the law or are continuously reacting. And thus, I think this volume brings the research into minority religions into the wider scale of research into religion, law, and politics, particularly by providing the perspectives and relations of minority religions to these social institutions. The editors of this volume have expanded the circle of contributors by inviting not only the scholars from various disciplines like sociology, anthropology, law, but also other professionals as well as the members of minority religions. In other words, the reader might find in the volume chapters written by the scholars engaged for a long time in the research on minority religions, and also chapters written by human rights activists and members of minority religions. The volume contains 13 papers, providing wide range of perspectives into the way minority religions were reacting to the law in diverse geographical areas, democratic and authoritarian countries, however, representing mainly global North societies. From Japanese Tenrikyo and Aum Shinrikyo to Estonian pagan group House of Tara, from Dukhobor group in Canada to Church of Almighty God from China, and from Unification Church to Scientology, Jehovah's Witnesses and Essenes, this volume provides examples of diverse minority religions and their attempts to react to the law, to challenge existing legal norms, and find their own place in the existing legal frameworks. The cases discussed in the volume engage the reader into historical circumstances of social inclusion of minority religions and very recent attempts by the Western countries to exclude minority religions persecuted in authoritarian countries. Besides, the volume provides the overview of minority religions' attempts to secure their rights with the help of international institutions such as Council of Europe, European Court of Human Rights, and the United Nations. And finally, the volume also provides rich theoretical generalization on the issue of the way minority religions react to the law in contemporary society. In general, the volume is grounded on rich material based on various methodological approaches, containing historical and recent legal document and literature analysis, as well as empirical research with interviews and participant observation. The reader is merged into the discussion with possibility for comparison how diverse minority religions act under various social and political conditions, what measures are taken in the fights for their rights. The strength of the volume lies in the diversity of cases, countries, approaches, but one may also say that weakness also lies within the same diversity, as usually it might be seen as the obstacle for more in-depth analysis. The evaluation at this point would depend on the position of evaluator and expectations for the volume. In my opinion, the theoretical background for this book is solid and empirically grounded. The richness of provided material invites the reader for its further application in the future research. I believe that book provides valuable addition to the scientific knowledge on minority religions, their role and place in contemporary societies and states. Thus, it might serve as handbook for scholars of religion, sociologists, anthropologists, legal and political scientists working in the field of religion, law, and politics. The diversity of cases analyzed in the volume might be valuable material for the classes of sociology, anthropology, political science, and law. And the material provided by the contributions from some members of minority religions and their interpretation in this volume might serve as a solid ground for further research into particular minority religion relations with society and state. And finally, I believe the volume should be of interest for general readers interested in the way minority religions find their way in various legal and political contexts, and by doing this, remind us of the complicated issues that majority-minority boundaries bring and how much attempts and sacrifices this might need. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Milda. That was amazingly in time, quite an accomplishment for an academic. And so now we're going to have a respondent to the Dr. Mickler's chapter. And this is Nicholas Kiaya, who is the in-house legal counsel for the UCI entity that is referenced in this chapter, and he's going to respond to what's in that chapter for about 5 to 10 minutes, bearing in mind that most people here probably wouldn't have read the chapter as yet. You ready, Nicholas?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Yeah,
Oh,
you're good to
Great.
go.
I was muted, sorry. You know, joining in with all the others, I congratulate the editors and Inform on the book. Likewise, I especially applaud Inform for hosting this event and for its commitment to providing facts. I think that says that right in your website. And to that extent, it's quite interesting to hear the comments from Mr. Hill and Miss Ališauskienė, I hope I said that correctly, about the usefulness of this book. And in that regard, I really want to underscore how important it is that what is published in the book, while getting information from first sources certainly is valuable, meaning their direct accounting, their advocacy and conviction for the group needs to be differentiated from actual facts. You know, scholarship in the realm of new religious movements is vital on multiple levels, especially for charismatically founded religious movements facing leadership succession. However, in the case of Dr. Mickler's chapter and its treatment of a pending religious leadership controversy, I offer to this audience, especially the publisher and the book editors, profound disappointment. Dr. Mickler's chapter frankly falls short with respect to his portrayal of a currently pending lawsuit in Washington, D.C., namely in his portrayal of the polity of the unification movement as if it were fully settled. I've been admonished by Dr. Richardson to be brief and non-legalistic. I am a lawyer. I'll do my best not to be legalistic, and will do my best to address my concerns very summarily. My points are vital for anyone considering the unprecedented wave of intra-unification movement lawsuits filed by Dr. Mickler's employer beginning around 2009. Someone commented about the view of lawyers, I think it was Mr. Hill. Reverend Moon basically said that in a world centered on God, there would be no need for lawyers. We certainly did not resort to putting snakes in mailboxes, but we certainly viewed litigation as a form of solving disputes as something quite undesirable in society. So I just make a few points, mindful of Dr. Richardson's admonition. First, the term Unification Church and Unification Movement mean the same thing. They do not refer to any particular organization and have been used interchangeably. Any notion of a duty to support the Unification Church references a duty to advance the shared mission of the international constellation of churches and related nonprofit organizations and for-profit businesses that derive from the messianic ministry of the late Reverend Dr. Sun Myung Moon. Second, all post-2009 lawsuits were filed amidst a leadership vacuum surrounding the movement's charismatic leader and messianic central figure, Sun Myung Moon, who was rapidly diminishing mentally and physically and died less than 10 years ago. Since around 2010, the unification movement has been facing a full-blown schism. Multiple parties claim conflicting views of unification theology, leadership, and organizational policy. Succession to Sun Myung Moon as movement leader is disputed. Dr. Mickler, I suspect taking cues from civil litigators, which I would hope that scholars would not do, inexcusably enshrouds this factual context of a schism in theologically neutral legal terminology. This is not a property dispute. The alleged legal rights and obligations his employer is asserting arise from, and in order for a court to enforce them, require that court to decide in the midst of a religious schism, who is the Unification Church? Who is its spiritual leader? Who decides what advances the charitable purpose of the Unification Church? Is it to advance the mission as set forth by Reverend Moon's widow, the only begotten daughter, as she calls herself, or the head of the organization that I'm a part of, Dr. Yunjin Preston Moon, the fourth Adam? Such questions are not, as a matter of law, for US, British, Korean courts to decide, or any society that respects religious freedom. Donations cannot be legally condemned, as Mr. Mickler does, without identifying the leadership or theology of the Unification Church. His characterization of directors as rogues is inexcusable. His own earlier writings underscore the seriousness of his omissions in his chapter. I quote him again. This is his quote: "The Unification Church refers to an international constellation of churches and related nonprofit organizations and for-profit businesses that derive from the messianic ministry of Reverend Moon." His employer's leader, likewise Hak Jahan, quote, "The Family Federation is not the Unification Church because Family Federation is merely one of the providential organizations that are part of the Unification Church." As for Dr. Mickler's various DC court rulings, his explanation of them that are now under review by a higher court, he once again fails to mention the District of Columbia Court of Appeals repeated admonishment that the lower courts avoid religious entanglement. There are many more examples. However, I will stop here and welcome and accept Inform's invitation to publish a more detailed, no more than 700 words, reply with authoritative sourcing for those who question the veracity of my statement. I thank you all for listening. And again, my congratulations on the book and again on the mission of Inform and your books in informing lawyers and judges of new religions. They're going to look to your books. And if there are statements in there that are not balanced or that don't really state the facts accurately and fairly, your books will be misused. Thank you very much for giving me this slot.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was very clear and concise and helpful insights. And now it is the co-editor, Dr. Jim Richardson's turn to respond to all the respondents and make his own observations about the volume and the process of making it.
Okay, can you hear and see me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, then I'll proceed. I could use an hour, but I'll try to limit myself. Lots of provocative things were said, and Eileen and I both appreciate them very much. I want to say that putting this book together was very difficult. It is true that we have a variety of offerings of various kinds in the book, everything from serious theoretical building typologies down to very minute, careful discussions of individual groups and laws they were dealing with in some countries. So I hope people appreciate, and I think everyone does, that we were hoping to provoke more interest in this fascinating topic, because as Mark Hill has well pointed out, some of us are getting tired of writing and reading about how governments treat minority religions. It's time to look at the other side, and that's what this book was attempting to do. And there's some fascinating questions that come up, and as I talk about these, I'll try to respond to some of the comments made by our learned commentators on what they saw in the book. It is, of course, that in a sense, we were very limited in the very countries we could choose from. There are nations that basically don't allow minority religions to do anything except go underground or not exist. And so we do have in a way, a narrow focus. It's mostly Western countries that we've involved in certain kinds of religions. I would have liked to have expanded it, and maybe another volume we can do that if we've got the time and energy. But there's several questions that come up in my own thinking. I've been fascinated for years, for instance, about the impact of the law on the beliefs and practices of minority religions. And I think it's worth noting that we see a number of examples of how at least the practices, if not the very beliefs themselves, are modified by the interactions of these groups with the legal structure of the societies in which they're involved. But it's also worth noting, and here I would come to a question that I think Mark Hill raised. We also see a situation where some of these minority religions have developed immense legal prowess and have exercised it in a number of forums, international and national. And I would particularly mention, in fact, the the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Scientologists. I think it would be a good contest to launch as to which of those has had the most impact. The witnesses have won over 50 cases in the United States Supreme Court, and there are over 60 cases that they've won in the European Court of Human Rights. So looking at how some of these groups react, I think, is interesting. And it raises some interesting questions, as I said, about how it affects their beliefs and practices. It raises interesting questions, as some have commented, about the lawyers these folks use. Some of these groups have chosen to train their own lawyers, and I've already mentioned a couple of those. I'm aware of the fact, for instance, that I know at least one group, the Unification Church, actually paid some people to go to law school because they thought they would be of use later in possible legal actions. And we all know about the legal prowess of the witnesses in Scientology and some other groups. So it's very fascinating to think about how these groups get organized. And then moving beyond that, it's interesting to go back to what Mark Hill said. He said the term cause lawyering was a new concept for him. Well, if he'd been in America in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, it would have been more familiar perhaps, because cause lawyering actually is something that came out of the social movements literature, and particularly the environmental movement, where lawyers got involved to try to protect the environment in various ways. And now that term, that idea, is being applied in the area of religion in various ways. So it's something to look at. It's who's helping and why are they helping. It's worth noting that, and I think Mark Hill just hinted at this, there's a possibility that some cause lawyers are doing more than just trying to promote religious freedom. It's possible, this is a research topic for some of you to consider, it's possible that some cause lawyers are actually using minority religions for broader and bigger purposes. And that's an interesting question, I think, that was implied in some of what Mark Hill was talking about. I could talk more about various things, but I would make at least one other point that I don't think any of the practitioners alluded to, any of the commentators, excuse me. If a religious group does in fact try to use the legal system to defend themselves or accomplish their own goals in terms of their ability to survive, their ability to practice, their ability to proselytize, there is an interesting implication of that. If you use the legal system and the legal system ends up ruling against you, you're stuck. You said you're going to use this system, and if you use it and you lose, then you may be limited in what you can do, what you can't do. So I would think that that's another interesting possible research topic that I hope some would pursue. Just what is the effect when a minority religion deals with the legal system, deals with the government, and does not accomplish what it wants to? We've talked about in our book a number of areas where groups were successful, and that's another, typically they were successful, or we might not have heard of them or known about them. But what happens when they're not successful? What effect does that have? So I've rambled around a bit trying to make some sense out of some of the comments that have been offered by our commentators, all of which I thought were very insightful, and I particularly appreciated the fact that all of them thought that the book, even if somewhat limited in some cases, was a valuable contribution to a whole new area of research. And Eileen and I certainly hope that others will pick up on this and pursue some of the research topics that we suggest in the volume and that I've mentioned briefly here today. So with that, I'll stop and let other people have a chance to respond to what was said, including my own comments.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So now we've promised to give some of the chapter authors a chance to make a few comments if they want to, either about the chapter or response to the book or whatever they'd like to talk about. But we've asked that we keep these to just 2 or 3 minutes, although we're making pretty good time here. So I know a few of you have emailed saying that you definitely wanted to make comments. I think if you raise your hands, so we'll start with Tony Brace. Tony?
Thank you very much. Thank you for a fascinating evening and some very insightful comments so far. Basically, all I want to say is that from the experience of Jehovah's Witnesses, Inform has done a really excellent job. All minorities are vulnerable to misunderstanding and misrepresentation. And sometimes unpopular minorities who have a message that doesn't commend itself are more subject to that than others. So it's good to have objective information. And we respect Inform for presenting objective information, even if it's not always what we want to hear. But our experience, Jehovah's Witnesses' experience, is that laws are occasionally prejudiced against minorities, but far more often misapplied. And I can think at the moment of examples of the misapplication of extremist legislation throughout Russia and Russia's satellites, the misapplication of registration legislation to prevent minority groups from functioning. There are worrying trends in the world. Minority religions are squeezed between what Massimo Introvigne has discussed at length, state and individual rights, and sometimes find themselves the meat in the sandwich when these rights are being pressed. But Jehovah's Witnesses have generally found independent courts to be fair, especially the higher courts. There are occasional aberrations, c'est la vie, but we've often found that time will correct injustice. And in my chapter, I try to point out 1 or 2 examples of that in the United States, in Europe, and in South Korea. One of the chats has raised the question of Africa. That's been our experience in some of the countries of Africa as well. You can think of a particular case in Namibia. But where we've benefited is from excellent lawyers. There's been talk about cause lawyers. Well, maybe you could call them that, but I think a good lawyer is somebody who is conscious of professional duties as well as the cause that he might support. And we've benefited that many of our lawyers are volunteers. And all right, they're believers in the cause, but they are also believers in the profession that they belong to. Finally, I'll say that sometimes minorities are subject to paranoia. They are defensive as a result of their experience. So from my point of view, I would like to say that Jehovah's Witnesses are conscious of this danger of paranoia. If any academics want objective information about us, some of our branches will offer themselves as a resource. Our Office of Public Information, based in the United States with a branch in Germany, and the European Association of Jehovah's Witnesses. Feel free to use us as a resource. Thank you for allowing me to be here this evening.
Fantastic. Thank you for your contribution. The next contributor who wanted to have a word is Eric Rue. Eric?
Yes, thank you. Well, first, I need to say that it was a great opportunity to have this chapter in the book. And I think nobody in the world does something like Inform does. and its opportunities for me, of course, but I think for all new religious movements and religious minorities. Then I would like to answer some comments from Mark Hill. He was saying that maybe we should ask who was the movement the more litigious. And I want to say that if I read the medias, I'm sorry for the others, but Scientology wins. Of course, I think maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses have more cases. I don't know exactly, I did not count, but that was more a joke. I would like to say that entering in the field of law for religion is not something that is natural. And the title of the book is Reaction to the Law. And it's important because I think religions only go into that field when they are threatened by law first. It's a reaction to a threat, and that's important to understand. And I would make a parallel, maybe a bit, maybe I should not, but you know the Shaolin monks in China developed a great expertise in martial arts because they were persecuted. But at this time, the persecution was with spikes and swords, and they had to defend themselves. And they developed Kung Fu. And I think now the persecution is quite different for the minority religions, and we develop a kind of Kung Fu of the law. And that's why many movements become very, like Jim Richardson said, become like expert in the handling of the law. And I would say that to answer the question that that sometimes you lose, and what happens when you lose. And I think this is of course already that already happened to all the movements. The Jehovah's Witnesses lost some cases, the Scientology lost some cases, and it tells you that actually the victories that these movements had, there was a necessity of a huge operation that has developed. And it's not just that you take lawyers and you win. It's much more than that. It's resources. That means you need to have the money to fight and win, because you have to pay lawyers, even if you have some volunteers. But volunteers are human resources that you need to train. You need to have organization. You need to know the law. You need to have a kind of strategy, because my parallel with Kung Fu could be done also with the art of war of Sun Tzu. You don't go if you don't think you are going to win. So you need to know when you go, when you don't go. And sometimes it's more important to not go and not litigate than to litigate. And these are choices that you have always to do. And so I think the book is very interesting in that sense. But also I concur and I agree that there is much more to say, and it could even be like the first book of a long series only on that topic, because there is much more to say. And even for me, in my chapter, I had the impression to write a summary of what I would have to write. And I think it could be the same for the other chapters. And thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eric. And now Massimo Intravigna would like to have a few words.
Thank you. Yes, as Marat mentioned, the chapter Rosita and I wrote is somewhat different from the others, because it's about a specific branch of the law, or refugee law, and it's about members of a Chinese new religious movement who escaped from China and tried to obtain asylum in more than 20 different countries. Now, I believe that's an interesting field, because we will see more of these cases. For instance, we start having decisions about Jehovah's Witnesses escaping from Russia, where they are banned and persecuted and trying to get asylum in Finland and other countries. The case of Church of Almighty God, however, is unique because there are more than 5,000 applications for asylum filed between 2014 and now around the world. Most or a good number of them have not yet been decided, not even by the first administrative authorities, but some have been decided. And the chapter in the book serves as a sort of template for examining decisions. And in a few days, in the issue of May, June of the Journal of Chesdur, there will be a 132-page long article by Jim Richardson and Rosita and me discussing 270-something administrative authorities and court decisions in a number of different countries, which addressed asylum requests from members of the Church of Almighty God. And I was in a United Nations conference and everybody acknowledged that's a unique case about the new religious movement. Cases decided by courts and administrative authorities about Falun Gong, for instance, are much less throughout the world. So it's a unique opportunity to study how religion-based refugee claims by members of a new religious movement are differently decided in the different countries of the world. And my last comment, if I may, because that's part of the strength of this book in general, in our explanation of the refugee claims of the members of Church of Almighty God, one interesting part is the interaction not only with lawyers and judges and courts and immigration authorities and humanitarian NGOs, but it's the interaction of the refugees with scholars of new religious movements. Actually, scholars of new religious movements played a very important part when these asylum claims were accepted, including Eileen Barker in the only case decided in the United Kingdom, which was rejected in first degree but accepted on appeal. Jim Richardson also almost picked up a fight with Chinese embassies trying to deny his expert opinions, and Rosita and I also helped the refugees of Church of Almighty God. And an interesting part of these 270 and more decisions is how many of them quote scholars, which are actually part of this webinar. So I believe scholars are not only observing this interaction between NRMs and the law, but increasingly they are also part of it, and this is certainly true in cases involving refugees and asylum claims. And I believe it's a responsibility, and it's something in a way exciting for scholars, because sometimes our works as witness literally may decide about the life and death of people, because some of those who have been sent back to China have disappeared there, and normally they don't reappear. So the work of the scholars sometimes has to do with very important issues, really life and death issues, and goes beyond the impassionate ivory tower style academic observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know there's several other chapter contributors who were thinking about saying something, but I don't want to call you out if you have changed your mind now. So just if you know who you are, feel free to unmute and have a word if you're a chapter author and want to say something. I see Susan's raised her hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
I would also like to congratulate the author, the editors, and my fellow contributors. And it's quite an honor to be in this volume. And what I find so refreshing about it, and in fact avant-garde, is that it's very unusual to have this perspective, this kind of inside view of what goes on when a new religion is accused of a crime. We're all familiar with the studies of new religions who get in trouble. And indeed in France, Nivelut assumes that any group that's a quote sect or cult is inevitably going to get in trouble and crimes will inevitably be committed. And that's why they passed the Abu Pikar law, of course. We've had studies of how the law reacts to crimes in new religions, and Stuart Wright in particularly has looked at how the law tends to overreact in Waco and our book Storming Zion. So it's really fascinating to have this study of how the groups react, and it shows a kind of empathy for those who are presumed innocent. And it shows the complexity of what goes on in a new religion. And it's actually a great learning opportunity to study how religions change when they're, when the secularizing forces of legal battles are coming up. Another thing I really like about this book is that members of new religious movements are included as contributors. And of course, that's one of the pleasures of going to Inform or Chesnor, and it makes it a much richer conference than other ones I go to. And of course, in my experience, and I'm referring to what Massimo said about how scholars have become part of the action. I've been an expert witness 6 times, mostly because I study the 12 tribes and they're constantly spanking their children. And what I've noticed is that usually the administrators in a new religion are the ones who handle the legal battles. And some of them are very impressive how they overnight become experts in the law. Of course, necessity is the mother of invention. And another fascinating thing I've noticed is in some of the groups, there seems to be a kind of folk law that develops underneath the secular law. So although in court they're responding in a very rational secular way, when they're back in their commune, they're bringing in the Bible or the end of the world, the millennium or Satan as somehow being involved in this court battle. And they often create rituals to help themselves prepare for, court the next day. I've been involved in 2 such rituals. And they also tend to mythologize the law. So of course we have, the Constitution is God's, and I noticed even in France that the Declaration of the Rights of Man has become somewhat mythologized. There was a big demonstration where different groups, the Raelians, the 12 tribes and so on, were all participating in a public demonstration with their own, understanding of this. So I like the concept of the 3 Fs, fight, flight, and freeze. And as Jim Richardson mentioned, it would be great if, in fact, I think this is true, that this book will start a new kind of research initiative. And you could write a book on flight. And it's very interesting to look at how groups succeed in evading authorities for years. Of course, there's the family, the children of God, who had secret, administrative hideouts that were called, I think, Crow. and they were Salah or secret underground. So they were never, the leaders were never arrested. And then we have groups that hide their children when the, social workers come in. And so it's interesting looking at the social factors that make flight a viable response. And I think there has been stuff already written on fight, how new religions try to change the law. Of course, Informus has had written books on that. Well, actually, I think I've pretty well said everything. So I'd just like to sum up. This is a fascinating topic, and I do think it will probably lead a new departure in research, and I hope to be part of that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan. Dr. Mickler would like to say something now. He contributed a chapter. Can you unmute yourself, Dr. Mickler?
There.
There you are.
Okay, thank you.
Peter, you'll be next.
Yep. I wish I could say it's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening, but having had my article subject to criticism or even attack, all I can say is that I would invite you to look at the article yourself and make your own judgment. I don't know whether you've been able to see it or not. Nicholas was able to convey his theory of the church and movement in line with his employer. Unfortunately, the courts have not seen it that way. This particular case between the Family Federation and now UCI has been in the courts for a decade. There have been issues about whether the court could actually, the standing issue, I think, is the main point. UCI argued that Family Federation did not have standing to bring the case because it did not represent the Unification Church. And also the standing of the court was questioned to adjudicate the case because they said it tread on First Amendment grounds. The major issue, first I want to say that this occupied about 20% of my article. And the first half of the article dealt with litigation that the church was involved in since it arrived in the United States from, say, 70 into the mid 80s, in which the church was busy surviving and trying to vindicate its standing as a bona fide religion. Having done so, the church enjoyed about 25 years of relative stability until in the period leading up to the passing of the founder in 2012 and afterwards. Litigation has emerged mainly internally, not with the host society, but within between the Family Federation, which sees itself as being interchangeable with the Unification Church, the historical Unification Church, and groups, particularly two groups that have seceded from Family Federation, led by two of Reverend Moon's children. So the UCI case involves major assets that were the property of the Family Fed prior to UCI separating itself from Family Federation. So the article takes the case up to the point at which the DC court rendered a summary judgment in favor of Family Federation in 2019. They ruled that the efforts the organization was originally established by the Unification Church and was formally incorporated as the Unification Church International. And its purpose was to support activities of the Unification Church and Unification churches around the world. In 2010, those bylaws, the incorporation was amended. The name was dropped. Any reference to Unification Church was dropped. And the assets of UCI were conveyed to new organizations that were created under by the board. And they took those assets and they deposited them in a new organization, that Kingdom Investment Foundation, and were deposited in Swiss banking accounts. So the court basically ruled in favor of Family Federation. Then the issue became one of remedies. So the ruling came down in December, very recently, and the court ruled that the amendments that the UCI had implemented in 2010 would be rescinded, that the board members would be removed, and that the board members would be liable for $532 million to pay back, along with interest from the time of the prejudgment period. So this was a summary judgment in favor of Family Federation against UCI. Remedies came forth, which were favorable to Family Fed. And the decision on the remedy is currently under appeal. And it's an accelerated appeal. Both sides, the UCI side and the Family Fed side, have submitted their briefs, and the court will rule within the next month or so on this matter. And so it may be that we'll be able to see an end to this litigation, which has gone on for more than a decade. So I think that's all I will say on this at this point.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Mickler. And I mean, I encourage those who are interested in this to both read the chapter, and we're also going to publish a response from Nicholas Kia to get in more depth into this discussion. And now we have a final contributor. He'll have another 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll open it up to general question. And I thank you everyone for being so patient. And it's been fantastic to hear such a variety of perspectives. So Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I'll be brief. I am very grateful that I get the chance to comment here. I really agree with Mr. Mark Hill that this is a very significant book indeed. Why I think that this book is extremely important, I have 3 reasons for that. It gives religious minorities a voice. Religious minorities didn't have a voice for so many decades and years, or very rarely had a voice, because there were 3 powerful entities which blocked religious minorities to speak up, which is the politicians, mainstream churches, and of course, the media. So it reminds me of a British writer, famous British writer, who said that politicians would do anything to please their constituents. They would even give them missionaries for dinner if they could please if the constituents demand. So sadly, there's some truth in that. This fact is not to be underestimated, that the religious minorities need a voice, and this book is playing a very important role in this. Media, they were supposed to report the facts, but sadly, as a representative of religious minorities, we had little chance to get media to listen and report according to the facts, because they often twisted the stories, and then members of religious minority groups, they lost trust in the media. They didn't even want to communicate anymore with media. Regarding religious minorities, they were very partisan and biased. Now scholars give a voice to the minorities, and this is very powerful, actually. So the second reason why I think this book is very important, it makes a great reading for teachers and religious scholars. I mean, my son is doing a PhD in religious studies, and I know how people appreciate that. And also, it gives the insider narrative to also to media representatives, through media professionals, and the insider narrative and the scholarly perspective. So a third reason is members of the different religious communities, they will enjoy reading this book because it shows to them that also others have suffered, have faced many challenges which were very similar to their challenges. They don't feel so lonely anymore, and they can understand that there are other religious communities who have had similar struggles, and this will definitely give them strength. Let me summarize. Inform has done more for religious freedom than many others who were advocating religious freedom and human rights, with a few exceptions, of course. Dr. Massimo Introvini, Willy Fortre, and maybe Susan Palmer. But Inform has done a fantastic job in a big leap in promoting religious freedom for religious minority groups. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you for those very generous words. Is there any general questions from the audience? You can raise your hand, you can type in the chat box. You can send me a private message if you want me to read out your question. There's a recommendation for further reading about new movements in the Unification Church in the chat box. I don't know if Eileen, if you'd like to come back and respond to anything, or there's still a few other chapter authors who haven't felt a need to say anything.
I can see that Anna is waving her hand.
Oh, sorry. If you're waving your hand in the video, I can't always see you. So it might be better just to type in the chat box or jump in.
Too.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Well, my name's Philip Bruard. I'm a former member of the Unification Church. I didn't expect to say anything this evening and just to listen, but I feel I have to say something about the background, because the UCI is basically primarily, it was a media organization. When Reverend Moon came to the States, he felt he had a mission to warn the Western world about communism and the dangers of communism, and also to protect the world against what he considered, what he called secular humanism and the breakdown of family values. This took the form of a very strong pro-Republican kind of agenda. So the idea was that the newspaper outlets, particularly the Washington Times, was a way to influence the Republican Party in particular. And so if you read there's a book written by Reverend Quark, who is behind the whole support of Preston Moon, who was the oldest son. He kind of explains it differently, and I'm not saying I agree with him, but he's one of the very early disciples of Reverend Moon, who is highly respected in the movement. But he sees the schism as being what he calls a cosmic conflict, a difference of opinion about the direction of the movement. And it's very interesting that there was such a scramble over the media outlets, the media aspect and the assets. But it wasn't just about the assets, it was also about a view of the direction of the movement in itself, whether, you know, one side felt it should be more of like a church, the other side wanted it to be more a broader organization, maybe more embracing politically. But I'm not saying that I agree with one side or the other, but just I thought I might as well put that in to explain what this is all about, or what an aspect that wasn't mentioned. Also, a very important aspect I felt, and it was quite a big deal when I joined the church in 1980, was the Donald Fraser Committee and what was nicknamed Careergate. And some particularly went, well, but not only in the Democrat Party, but also the Republican Party were concerned about a religious leader who was trying to, what they felt was influencing the situation in Korea because of Reverend Moon's concern about the vulnerability of South Korea in relation to North Korea. So he felt that he had a mission to protect his homeland, the fatherland, if you like. And so that very much guided the very early way that the unification movement tried to influence politicians. And that's what I feel would be quite useful to study further, not only the legal aspect, but also how the new religious movements basically view politics and its relationship to politics. Thank you.
Thank you. That's interesting thoughts for further study. And we've got another interesting question from an anonymous chat. This is probably for the editors and chapter authors primarily, but any academic. It's a question about what gives a religion legitimacy, and how much research has there been on what gives legitimacy to a religious movement. I think maybe Eileen's best place to start with that one. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Legitimacy is in the eye of the beholder. That's it.
Do you know of any academic studies on social legitimacy and how that's leveraged by minority religions, or how they gain more?
I think a lot of work is, it might not be saying it directly, but there's just masses of stuff, because in a way, people are fighting for legitimacy, for status. And if you're a minority religion, using the term minority to mean that there's a majority and you're the underdog in some way. Minority can just mean statistical, but there is an idea that you are not as legitimate as the majority. But as those of us who in the time of the cult wars in the 70s and 80s, who were called cult apologists, we were told that by actually studying the new religions, we were giving them legitimacy. Whatever we wrote didn't, that was another matter. So, I mean, it really is an enormous question, and it covers practically everything, because it's how things are interpreted. If Scientology, for example, or any group is doing a Hare Krishna charity work, this is defined as not really doing good, but as PR, in order to, and therefore downgraded. And the whole of language that is used, I'd love to do a book on new religions and the language that is used for them, in a very sort of Mary Douglas, for those of you who know her, anthropologist way of how what evaluative overtones you put in a particular category. So cult used to be just a pure descriptive part of a model for sociologists, and then it became something that means something, a religion I don't like, that's bad, that has no legitimacy. But I think I'll just stop there because I could give a lecture for 3 hours, and I want my supper.
Thank you, Eileen. Well, we've got only about 10 more minutes. But another of the contributors, Effie Folks, has asked if Jim Richardson might expand upon a comment he was making on this subject about the potential loss of legitimacy when a religious group loses in courts, and if you could expand on that a bit more, Jim.
What was the question?
The question was about, is there a potential loss of legitimacy when a minority religion chooses to go into litigation? And were you making some kind of implication of that, or can you expand on that in a bit more?
I'll try. I also have another comment I'd like to make if time allows. Yes, if a religious group decides they want to use the legal system, or that they must use it, maybe they've been hauled into court and they have to defend themselves, in that case, they're kind of stuck in that they may find that their own members do not accept that as a forum of legitimacy, and it may fly in the face indeed of some of their very core beliefs about who's in charge and what God or whomever has plans for them. So yes, it can cause internal problems because, as I said, if you do go on the offensive and you sue someone, a government who's harassing you or something like that, then by the very implication of doing so is that whatever happens in court, you're going to abide by the result. And so that could severely limit you. And there are many instances of practices being changed in some of the groups that we've talked about today by virtue of legal rulings. And practices is one thing. I think there's some examples of actual theology changes that have been impacted by legal actions against groups, or when a group has gone to court and basically implied will abide by the result. That means they're going to change. I mean, Christian Science changed their practices about what to do when brought into court over child deaths with spiritual healing, for instance. You could make an argument that's not a theological change, but it's a pretty important practical change when you decide not to excommunicate people who decide to use regular medical care for their children. But there are a lot of instances like that. It's a very interesting research topic, and your question that you posed provoked me to think that. But I did want to make one more quick comment, if you'll allow it, Susan. Is that all right? One of the chapters in the book is particularly interesting to me, and that's Effie Focus chapter about the European Court of Human Rights. Maybe it's because the European Court of Human Rights is an extremely important court about which I have written, including some with Effie. But I would suggest that people take a look at that chapter, which has its strong empirical basis and also some very interesting theory, that it focuses our attention briefly on the long-term implications of some of these actions. Our book, in a sense, except I think for Effie's chapter, focused on what an individual religious group was doing and how an encounter with the law affected them. And Eileen and I both, and some of the other chapters, offer some theoretical ideas that I hope will be of interest and people will pursue them. But it is worth noting that grassroots project that Effie's been involved in for a long time has some real implications for what we're talking about today. about how minority religions impact the law. If they impact the law, what effect does that have on other religious groups? There's been some allusion to that, of course, in some of the comments, but since nobody mentioned Effie's chapter, I thought I would call that to people's attention because it's certainly worth looking at in that regard. Thanks. I'll quit.
Hiya, and I'm having trouble seeing people if they just are raising their hands on camera. So I've gotten a message that Anna King was trying to say something. If you want to unmute yourself, if you did want to say something. If anyone else wants to comment, if you can either put it in the chat box or just send me a private message, that I can be sure to give you a time to speak before the end.
Sorry, can you hear me, Suzanne?
Yes, thank you, Anna.
Can I ask you a question? It's a very general one, and it may seem very trivial to you. Okay, I'm really interested in how you classify minority religions, and I notice that, in fact, the same religious groups come up again and again. My question is, and I'm not sure if I've sent it yet, religions can be minority religions in one country, majority in another. So I've written quite a lot extensively on ISKCON, which you would classify as a minority religion, but which actually in the States and here is seen as moving into the mainstream in many, many ways. I now do research in conflict areas and also support peace building efforts. I can give you an example of Rakhine. Rohingya are conceived of there as a religious and ethnic minority by the Buddhist Rakhine, and who've had to flee and are persecuted, regarded as genocide. They are in fact Muslim. So my question really is about how you discern which are minority religions and which are not, and the whole language about new religions. And I imagine that your language about new religions has given language about minority religions. I wonder if you find that language almost as problematic as the previous language. Sorry, this is so, I didn't mean to talk quite so much, but it's something that really, really interests me. And congratulations on your book, and I will read it. And I'm, you know, I know it's a huge, huge contribution, and what Eileen has done for so many years is amazing. I am interested in this classification that the same groups seem to come up again and again, and you know, the Unification Church, etc.
So Eileen's expressed an interest in answering that.
I'd be really grateful.
It's an ongoing question. There's no real answer. If you accept from Durkheim and going back to Mary Douglas, concepts are more or less useful, not more or less true. And with Inform, what we look at, we first of all said, well, Inform stands for Information Network, focus on religious movements. There's nothing new or alternative, it's just general. And very often we've had Church of England or Catholics speaking at seminars and contributing to books as Anglicans or as Catholics. We really just want to look at those religions which, well, perhaps to take up Peter's thing, don't otherwise have a voice. And you're right, there are some that keep coming up. Unification Church, well, I started my study with it. And as I started Inform, it's probably my fault, because I've been studying them since the early 70s. So I've got to know a lot of them. But we do actually have quite a few different religions. And I think I said we've got over 5,000 different religious organizations on the database. And of those, 1,000 plus are religions that became visible in UK since the Second World War and are currently active. And so we definitely don't define it. We've used alternative, we've used and spiritual, we've used communities, and all of you'll get a sort of Wittgensteinian family resemblance. There are a whole lot of, and there are some political movements as well that are called cults, and therefore, if they've got some sort of ideology, we include that. Ringo Ringve's article chapter is quite interesting from that point of view, that the pagans didn't want to use Christian language to be used in the law. I don't know if Ringo's still about. Perhaps Ringo, you could just very quickly say something on that if we've got time, and I'll shut up.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, it was a huge problem for them in Estonia. They said that that they are forced to use terms from a Lion tradition. And when the law was drafted, it was very rational in this sense that everyone is going to use the same terms in the law. And we said, well, this is going to be a problem. Nobody believed it until the pagans came and said that this is a violation of religious freedom. They are forced to use certain terms. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Some really interesting questions, and I think we could probably go on further. But we're going to call it for a close because I'm sure many of you have food to eat and other people in your lives to talk to. I would like to thank all of the contributors, the editors, and all of the participants who came to listen. We'll email everyone who registered the link to the recording, which might take us a week or two to put online. And meanwhile, if you have any other questions or comments about anything to do with new and minority religions or tonight's event, email us at inform@kcl.ac.uk, and we'll try our best to get back to you. Thank you all very much for attending, and congratulations for a fantastic volume. Oh, and one more thing, if you want a 20% discount on buying the book, which is slightly expensive and hardback, you can get one from the Routledge website at the moment, and you can encourage your libraries to purchase the item. Thanks.